You're listening to TFM.
Want to join in the conversation and share your thoughts on this episode? Join the Babel Conference, our listeners' discussion group on Facebook. Just type BABEL into the Facebook search field, and we'll look forward to seeing you there. Hello and welcome to TFM's local watering hole, the 602 Club, where I have become Death, the Destroyer of Worlds, and I am just one of your hosts, Matthew Rushing, and so excited to have back with us the one, the only, the sublime John Mills.
I am the Joker, Destroyer of Podcasts. There you go.
It's not far from the truth. I mean, you have destroyed that seat you're sitting on because nobody else sits in there.
I'll destroy anybody that sits in this seat. That's the thing. This is my seat.
So it's got your name placard on there. But we're going to be talking about the other side of the Barbieheimer with Oppenheimer this week. Very excited to get that going. But before we dive into this explosive new film from Christopher Nolan.
Sorry.
You can find us all over the place on social media. We've got Twitter at the 602 Club. We've got Instagram at the 602 Club TFM. We're also on Threads under the 602 Club TFM. We don't post there much because nobody uses that, but you can find us there. You can find the entire network online at trek.fm. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/trekfm. And of course, you can go over to the listeners discussion group on Facebook called the Babel Conference and talk to listeners from all over the world about all of the shows we're doing here. You can go to Patreon at patreon.com/trekfm and become part of our team. Make sure all of these shows keep coming to you. And if you love what we're doing, you can also help us out by subscribing wherever you're listening. That way you'll get our podcasts as soon as they drop. Share us on social media with friends. Word of mouth is the best way to grow a podcast. And of course, you can also help us out by giving us a star rating and review on places like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And we even, read those U.S. reviews of the Apple Podcasts out here on the show to say thank you. We know it takes a little bit of time, so go over there, do that for us, and help people find the show. So a couple of questions before we even get started just talking about the film and everything. So much about this film comes in its presentation, John,
yes.
Which, IMAX showings are selling out. The IMAX 70mm showings are running almost 24/7 in places like Dallas where, you have one 70mm IMAX screen. You've got all of these type of things happening. So I wanted to know, coming into this, how you saw this movie.
Great question, because I tried to see it in 70mm, but and this is where I sound like a terrible person, the only seats that were left sucked. And I was like, look, I'm willing to make the effort to see something in 70mm because Christopher Nolan, okay, it means something to him. And I'm like, I'm going to do what the director prefers sort of thing all the time. But I had to take my consolation prize and go to, there's this small chain that I live near called Epic XL, and they have their own large format. It would be comparable to digital IMAX. And so that's what I went, I went to their giant, large format theater to see it. So it was digital. So I'm sure that Christopher Nolan wants to hit me with a wet noodle, but it is what it is.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I live in the Portland area of the country, and there are no good theaters here, really. There is no 70mm at all. The only place in Washington State, I believe, that has a really good presentation would be about an hour and a half, almost 2 hours away from me. They have an IMAX laser, which I could have seen it in, but unfortunately just not close enough to be able to do that. So I got to see it on your regular old IMAX, not this, the official size screen. But I mean, it's digital too. I saw it the best I could. which is just kind of your Limax, IMAX, which is still a great presentation for this film because it's doing the slight variations of IMAX format too. You know, you get the full and then you get the one that's slightly smaller. And so, but I mean, the presentation was great. I thought the sound was phenomenal. The picture quality was astounding, as is with Christopher Nolan films. And, you know, I would have loved to have seen this in 70 millimeter, but the place that showed it in 70 millimeter in Seattle had closed, and I don't think they're open yet again. And that's where I'd seen like Dunkirk in 70 mil. But yeah, you know, unfortunately, Portland just absolutely sucks when it comes to theaters. So,
well, you know, so long as we're talking about format and everything and the effort, I live also near a Dolby Laser, and it's at Disney Springs. I live down here in Mouseville, and it is frustrating that this weekend, because it was at Disney Springs, they swapped out Oppenheimer at Dolby for the Haunted Mansion, which opened, because I couldn't see Oppenheimer the first week and everything. And that was frustrating because these contractual things that they talk about are nonsense. It's just dumb. They've got to find a better way to negotiate these sorts of things and say, you know, it doesn't make sense to have Haunted Mansion in our best theater. People are going to pay the premium to go see Oppenheimer here. Even if people are, you know, the whole Barbenheimer, however you pronounce it thing, this is, you know, just from the get-go that this is a movie that demands the best possible presentation. And it's just frustrating to me that these contractual obligations box these theaters in where they can't honor that.
Right. Well, and it, you know, I think one of the things, you know, where the movies are right now, it also just goes to show that having more premium theaters is better for theater chains, you know, because then if you've got more IMAX screens, you've got more Dolby Cinema screens, you have the ability to show more showtimes of something like Oppenheimer or Mission Impossible Dead Reckoning Part 1, which are vying for positions right now. And, you know, I know it seems like Oppenheimer might actually be extended because they're making so much money. And I know that, you know, Mission Impossible is actually looking to possibly come back into IMAX once the contract of, you know, Oppenheimer's up. So it's like, you see that this is actually really good for theaters. It's really good for the movie industry to have more of these premium formats, which means that, you know, if you're a theater chain and you want to make more money, you probably should upgrade more of your theaters to these premium format theaters because you can make more money and you can have more showings of all of these major films that are utilizing the bigness of these screens in a way that they're meant to be done. You know, in the way that George Lucas always talked about, you're making movies that should be experienced on the biggest screen possible because you're doing things on screen to which really accentuate and are accentuated by the size and the power of the sound system and all of that. Yes.
And I think that...
because size matters, John.
Well, you know, when it comes to something like this, absolutely. And I think that, you know, just so long as we're talking about presentation and contracts and stuff like that, obviously Barbie is the juggernaut right now. And I think that the thing that I love most is there is a lesson here that can be learned about not being competitive with a movie that comes out at the same time, but to find a way to either assist each other or ride along in the wake, because I will tell you honestly that the Barbie movie is the best thing that ever happened to Oppenheimer, because it started out as a kitschy joke to have Barbenheimer, but then people said, yeah, I'll commit to the bit. And they did these double features. And I can tell you honestly, number one, it demonstrates that this whole idea of no audience crossover is nonsense, that people just want to see good movies that are good movies. there aren't people who are going to be like, I refuse to see this movie. If it's a good movie, they'll go see it. I'm not picky like that. I'll go see any genre, whether it's, the Barbie, Oppenheimer, Mission Impossible, The Godfather, whatever, you name it, right? If it's good, it's good. And I think that there is a lesson. There's a moment in time here where if the marketing teams pay attention, they can understand that straight competition and trying to destroy each other is no longer the way to go. Figure out how to capitalize on somebody else's success and ride along with them, and you will enjoy success yourself. I think that has a lot to do with a 3-hour biopic, which, boy, I'm pretty sure that the quantum mechanics crowd isn't the $500 million box office crowd. That's a pretty niche kind of conversation.
No, I couldn't agree with you more. And, I was thinking about this. We went and saw Oppenheimer with some friends on that Friday, and the theater was jam-packed full of people because there were 2 big movies for people to see. I haven't seen the theater that packed in years.
Yeah.
And it was driven by the fact that you had people wanting to see both films. We saw Barbie on Thursday, and then the Friday we saw Oppenheimer. And so you're catching people doing that. They're trying to figure out which day we're going to go see this and which day we're going to go see this, right? And so that's the thing that you can learn. 1, like you said. 2, I think the other thing to learn is that people respond to original idea films. Look, Barbie is, yes, based off of something that has a lot of nostalgia to it, especially for women, but it's also original.
Yep.
You haven't had any Barbie movies before, right? The same thing with, Oppenheimer. It's an original story. It's a movie based off of somebody's life who's had a major impact on our world. And, of course, it's got one of the biggest, if not biggest name in directing these days attached to it. And so you do both of those things. And I think 100%, those are the lessons that Hollywood needs to learn, I think, on top of, hey, studios, I know it's going to cost you some money, but invest in more premium screen theaters and you will be making bukus more money. And so, where I am here, there's only one IMAX in our area. The other one is down, I think, in the OMSI in downtown Portland. Otherwise, there aren't any others. And so it's insane. If you're listening to me, AMC, where I live here in Vancouver, Washington, you have a theater there at the Vancouver Mall that you could easily transfer one of the theaters into an IMAX, so do it.
Never mind the fact that there's a science center near me that has an actual real IMAX screen that could be showing Oppenheimer, and they don't show commercial movies. And I'm from the DC metro area where an IMAX, they use the IMAX screens at the science centers. They were like, yeah, we love making money. Come on down here. And every time a Christopher Nolan movie came out, I would drive the extra 45 minutes to go out and catch one of these things. And it's like, it's a gold mine. It's a gold mine for film buffs.
Well, all of that said, this film itself has an interesting structure, as many Christopher Nolan movies do. And I wanted to talk to you about how you felt like, because I know, of course, that editing and story structure is such a huge part of how you enjoy film. And, using the Strauss confirmation hearings as a framing device, as well as the security hearing of Oppenheimer and him trying to get his security clearance renewed, both of those things kind of create this structure that allows us to walk through his life and set up the stage for the movie. How did that work for you? Did you like the way that this was structured? And did you feel like as it's flashing back to different points in his life and moving through time like that it worked?
Yes. This is the type of storytelling, I think, if you're going to tell a really long epic, it works really, really well. And it has the added benefit of Nolan is just an absolute master at this by this point. But the entire structure of it being structured around the chain reaction. The whole thing is about building a chain reaction and the little things bouncing back and forth and the little moments bouncing back and forth, and then it gets frenetic and then it gets big, and then we have our big climactic moment and the reaction keeps going and then it dies down. But it's still this wonderful tapestry that gets woven. And it's the same reason. And you know what? I will bring in a completely unrelated discussion point that Star Wars fans have all the time about whether you're going to watch Clone Wars in story order or whether you're going to watch it in release order where it bounces around. I can tell you, as somebody that prefers the release order thing, I love the story structure of this because it's how memory works. It bounces around. Nobody remembers their lives linearly. When you're telling the story of your life, you go, oh, well, yeah, okay, there was that. And then somebody says, well, what about this? Well, okay, yes, there was that too. And I think that what works best about it, I don't know if you agree or not, but I think what works best about it is the fact that Oppenheimer's world has color to it. Strauss's world is black and white. And they cross over and they intermingle in a very explosive way, but Oppenheimer is the one that's moving between the worlds. He's the quantum, he's the quantum traveler in these two worlds here. It's both things. And so I think the story structure really reinforces that point.
Yeah, I definitely want to hit that in just a second, because I think you're absolutely right. Something you said, though, triggered this idea, because you talked about the fact that this movie is all about the chain reactions that kind of set off this sequence of events, right? And so we're moving through all of the things that kind of lead to the moment where, the bomb is created, right? But then, just like the atomic bomb itself, there's the fallout that comes after that. And so you lead up to this crescendo, and yet there's still so much else to come, because that's not the end. The explosion is not the end. The rest of the movie is about the fallout of what happens afterwards. And so, this is one of the places where I think, when we talk about a director being at the top of his game with his craft, Nolan is an absolute genius in creating structure, which drives the thematic elements, which has so much story resonance, which everything is working and firing on all cylinders to support what he's doing overall, which creates this very cohesive whole. And when you think about the fact that this movie is legitimately, basically, people talking for 3 hours.
Yeah.
They're talking in rooms. They're talking outside. They're talking in rooms. They're talking outside. They're talking in rooms. They're talking. I mean, literally, that's all this movie is people just talking. And the fact that it is absolutely 100% riveting the entire time is because of the way in which Nolan is interweaving these story elements with the thematic elements within just the overall structure of what they're trying to do in the first place, which gives even more thematic resonance to what he's doing. And so everything fits together in this beautiful puzzle piece of a film. And by the end of it, you're just like, I got to see that again, because I got to kind of almost deconstruct the puzzle as you see it again, because you're really able to see how all the pieces are fitting together.
I took my daughter to see this. I was given the forewarning about some scenes that maybe a dad doesn't want to watch with his daughter, and I gave her the choice. I said, it's your choice whether you go or not. She's old enough to make that call. And so she decided to go. And what's interesting with what you're talking about is that this is going to sound weird. I'm not even sure how to phrase it, except for the fact that it is such a joy to see a film that, to your point, is people talking back and forth that engages a teenager the same way that an action movie or some other, whether it's a Marvel movie or a popcorn movie or Barbie or anything like that, it engaged a teenager who knows nothing about quantum physics, who knows only as much about history as the school system has deigned to teach her at this point, fully engaged and asking questions afterward. And even, just to share a funny story, when we were in the car ride home, I asked her what she thought of it, and she told me what she thought of it, and she said, but I didn't understand what the hell they were talking about in the first 20 minutes. And I laughed and I looked at her. I said, that's okay, honey. I know, but you understood what was happening. She's like, yes. I was like, then that part doesn't really matter that much. And she was talking about the math that they were talking about. She was like, what is even happening? I was like, oh, you'll get there. You'll get there. Don't worry about it. So.
Yeah, no, I think that's really great. I love, hearing that, because I think it goes to show that, these type of movies can do what they should do, which is to be able to reach a very wide audience. And I think, what Nolan is doing here, and of course we'll get more into some of these questions a little bit later, but the reason for making this film and having this discussion in the first place is because of the very important questions for humanity that come with this type of historical event. And that those questions are still questions to which I don't know if we've necessarily done a very good job of really answering ourselves because of where we are now. And so I love that, your daughter was able to not only be engaged in the film, but then asking questions. And I think what it does is it allows somebody like that to be able to see that history is not only interesting and fascinating, but worth exploring, and that, to me, that makes this a huge win for a film if it's doing that for, people like your daughter and just, people at large. We could use a society that is much more interested in history. And so I think that's beautiful. Now, you mentioned the idea of perspective with alternating between the color and the black and white. And, Nolan had talked about the idea that he wanted to convey both an objective and subjective perspective in the film. And so that the majority of the movie takes place from Oppenheimer's subjective experiences, but then they had the more objective black and white of Strauss's kind of timeline. And how did that work for you? Did you feel like that what Nolan was going for came across on screen?
I took it in a slightly different way. I get what he's saying there and agree. Yes. Okay. I get that. The way I took it was that it was basically saying Oppenheimer saw the big, like he saw the color, he saw the depth, he saw whether he appreciated it or not, he saw the beauty of things. He saw the complexity of life. He saw all the different layers, and that's why he could be friends with people he didn't necessarily agree with, or, there were things he was interested in, but he didn't subscribe to just one point of view, whereas Strauss's whole world, that black and white very much was fitting. He's a political creature. It's either this or it's that, and that's it. You're either on my side or you're my enemy. That's all that there is to it. And Oppenheimer was his enemy because Oppenheimer was not in lockstep with him and properly deferential to him and all of those sorts of things. And so I took it more, intended or not, that Strauss's world was a much starker, bleaker, colorless world, whereas Oppenheimer's life was dedicated to looking for things that had more substance to them than just the black and white.
Yeah, I think that's a great way to read it, and I really like the way that you put that, because I do think that that is such a, when we talk about this idea of perspective, one of the things that is beautiful about Oppenheimer as a character who, I think the movie doesn't shy away at all from the fact that he's not the world's best person in any shape or form, but he is somebody who is completely open in his mind to different ideas, to be able to explore an idea and maybe pull what's good from it and then discard what he thinks is not good, and that is something like you're saying with, the other side that Strauss kind of has, where everything is this completely black and white, where there is no gray, or there is no really testing of every idea to see, okay, is there merit here? And to ask those questions and then do the actual work intellectually. There's that wonderful scene where you see Gene challenging Oppenheimer, and he comes back at her about communism, and he's like read it in the original German, right? And she's like, oh, well, it's not really about, what it says. It's really more about how it feels, basically, but this idea of somebody who truly is willing to explore and wrestle with ideas as they're given to see what merit they have is an incredible thing. To be that kind of open-minded. And not just reject out of hand something because maybe somebody told you to, or it's popular to do so, And so Oppenheimer, in many ways, becomes this kind of almost Renaissance man in this film because of the perspective that he has, which is not only able to have a very clear thought process from the start, but he's also somebody who's willing to grow as a person, change. We see that also in the film, right? Like, he's a person who grows.
Yes, I think that's a yes and no. I think what's interesting is I think the movie posits that he changes, but getting back to the chain reaction thing, what I think is really interesting is that the film seems to posit the idea, and I think this is a valid one to explore, that a person can change without meaning to. We're used to, especially with movies, telling the story of a person as there's a big crescendo and a moment in time where they suddenly a switch was flipped and things were different. And I think very much instead, Oppenheimer speaks to the fact that it's a chaotic and unpredictable process. And is Oppenheimer different at the end of the film? Of course. Did he grow? I always assign intentionality with growth. Somebody making the effort to change in a certain direction. Whereas, to speak to your point, I think I would argue that the movie supports the idea that while he changes, his growth is not intentional. It simply happens. And so it speaks very much to that chain reaction side to it. A thing happens, he observes it, he does something, he observes its effect, and he might alter, or he'll move on, or he'll discuss, or something like that. But he doesn't do the action with the intention of changing. It happens, he observes, reaction, and then it brings about the change. Like his relationship with his wife. Does he ever really express remorse about cheating on her? That's debatable. Does he? Does he not? Or does he simply observe that it's something that hurt her, and there's a part of him where he realizes, okay, this was not right. This was a bad thing to have happened. Therefore, it should not be an experiment that I repeat.
No, I think it's a good way to put it. I think that I would say there are ways in which the character is clearly looking to grow and to change because he's willing to interact with all of these ideas, right? His whole is he his communist thing becomes because he's willing to interact with ideas and allow them to influence him. But I 100% agree with you. There are other places where, yes, either he doesn't change or that, like you mentioned, there are things that happen that lead to change that we weren't necessarily looking to allow that to happen. His work on the creation of the atomic bomb is something to which I think in many ways it's almost like he was denying that it was going to change him because he was not responsible, but it got to the point where he could no longer deny that he was. And that's the thing that he can never truly, at least in the way it's portrayed in the film, it's the thing that he can never truly admit to himself. It's one of the reasons that Christopher Nolan made this movie, is because he was so just struck by the idea that Oppenheimer actually never apologizes for the creation of the atomic bomb. And so it makes for this very complex character, this very complex person. And I think even just the complexity of the ideas that we're dealing with in the film, that we, deal with thematically, and the questions they had to ask about whether or not we use this and all of that stuff. Like, what it shows is how none of these questions are easy. So I think that your, explanation is very well put. And I think you put that in together with what I'm saying. It's like, you get this guy who's just incredibly interesting to read about, to watch a film about, because he's not one way or the other. He's just kind of all over the place in many ways, like you said, where it's all the atoms bouncing off one another. That's kind of who Oppenheimer is as a person. And so
I like that you call out about, the bomb, because I think that what Nolan, some of the strongest work in the film is when he's giving the speech to everybody at the end, and he's saying, "Oh, I just wish we could have developed it quicker and dropped it on the Nazis and everything." And what Nolan does with sound in that, to throw out there that it must have, and we all know that it must have, affected him on such a profound level, what he had unleashed, even though there were scientists when Germany surrendered that were saying, okay, ethically, we got to stop doing this. We can't keep doing this. This has got to stop at this point, because once it happens, it's there's no going back. And that scene where he's at the celebration, everybody's happy and celebrating and everything, and that roaring sound of the feet stomping, and him realizing and having that warble behind him, which was interesting because it was very evocative when it warbled, because it did it again in the film later. It was very evocative, and I found it very fitting that Cillian Murphy had that happen around him, because it was very evocative to what Nolan did in Batman Begins when Scarecrow's drug affected people. And this is yet another case of Nolan using a trick from his bag that he learned a long time ago. And he says, I know how to do this one, because he keeps putting more and more together as his films go forward. And it was so nice to see something, an older trick from his bag, emerge in something like this. I thought it was very cute. Not to belittle the emotional impact of that scene or how it's used, but to say that this is, you talk about a director at the top of his craft. A director at the top of their craft will use the tools that work and won't feel the pressure to say, I can't do that. I've done it before. Nolan says, it works, so that's how I'm going to do it.
No, I agree with you, because it is really so much about perspective too, right? Because what we're seeing is the internal perspective of a man who is greatly struggling with the thing that he's helped unleash on the world. And, that moment of him being able then to say what he knows the crowd wants to say, but has no desire to actually be saying.
Yes.
Because he's now terrified at his place in history. And so it's awesome. And I think, I don't think we could spend an entire podcast talking about the performances in this film, because pretty much everybody in Hollywood is in this movie.
Yeah,
but
that's true.
I mean, you've got Cillian Murphy, you've got Emily Blunt, Matt Damon, Robert Downey Jr., Florence Pugh, Josh Hartnett, Casey Affleck, Rami Malek, Kenneth Branagh. You've got Alden Ehrenreich. I mean, Tom Conti. This is insane, the amount of people that are in this film. And, everyone is astounding in it. Like, Nolan takes every single person that's in this film and gets their very best performance. Hands down.
And I think that, speaking of those performances, my daughter actually called out Emily Blunt and specifically cited the scene where she's envisioning Oppenheimer cheating on her at the hearing and what she conveys in that moment. And I think that Emily Blunt winds up having a performance that I hope does not get overlooked by other aspects of the film. I think that she gives an absolutely masterful performance with what's happening. I think that Tom Conti, I will call him out specifically because it would be so easy for somebody playing Albert Einstein to lean into some of the stereotypical tropes or characteristics or whatever you want to say, where, oh, you're playing Albert Einstein. Some people ham it up. He becomes larger than life because he's Albert Einstein. And Conti delivers a human being who is one of the few people that Oppenheimer can actually relate to. And so it's nice to see a film finally treat Albert Einstein as a human being. And I think Conti's performance has a lot to do with that. I think Matt Damon is great as General Groves. He's just so pitch perfect. It's so easy to forget a name like Matt Damon. It is so easy to forget that he is, in fact, a very talented actor. And I'll just close out my raves and everything. I agree with you. There isn't a bad performance in this film. Not a single one. I thought Alden Ehrenreich, I was so thrilled to see him, and I thought he was absolutely perfectly cast in his role. But I'll tell you, the guy that warmed my heart, that made me so happy to see him have an opportunity to really flex his acting chops again, was Robert Downey Jr. He's not Iron Man. This is the Robert Downey Jr. I grew up with. This is the Robert Downey Jr. who did Chaplin, who did Less Than Zero, who did all of these roles through the 80s and 90s where you're like, that guy's amazing. What an actor. And yes, he was perfect as Tony Stark, but he was Tony Stark for a long time. Tony Stark's Tony Stark. But man, Robert Downey Jr. coming out of the bleachers and just giving this type of tour de force performance again, where I forgot I was watching Robert Downey Jr. a couple of times. I was like, that's it. That's the guy. That's the guy that I remember.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that he was phenomenal. Everybody else you called out to there, their performances, there isn't anybody here that you're like, oh man, they kind of really let me down. They just didn't fit, everybody, again, Alden Ehrenreich giving the performance of a lifetime here. The way in which he reacts when Strauss has been undone is phenomenal. But I mean, this movie isn't what it is if you don't have Cillian Murphy just giving the performance of a lifetime. If he doesn't win the Oscar for Best Actor, the Oscars should just shut down because they're stupid. Because his performance here is so nuanced, is so good, and it all comes from so many times from just a look that he's giving that is worth 1,000 words that he could say. And the way in which then he plays with every single other person on screen, where he's making everybody better and they're making him better. It's just an incredible job. And so, I mean, and even too, something where, I think Florence Pugh really getting to play a different type of character than she's played before. This very psychologically damaged person who knows that she shouldn't be in need of another person like this, but can't help herself. It's just like everything about this was phenomenal. And, it's one of those things where, Wes Anderson can make anybody want to be in his films, but I think, Matt Damon even said when he was in couples counseling with his wife, he talks about that they worked on him in the sense that he wasn't going to be working as much, but the one stipulation was, but if Christopher Nolan calls, I'm gone. And then Christopher Nolan called. But that's the thing, is Nolan is using all of these people that you've seen in a variety of different places and making them their best selves on film. And so, and like you said, having them disappear into their roles. And that's phenomenal. I also think of just one last thing, Emily Blunt's performance there when she's giving her testimony and it starts off rocky. And by the time it's done, she's making a fool out of this prosecutor. It's just great. And so I thought hands down, this cast across the board, all of them could win awards for what they did here.
There is a criticism of Emily Blunt's character arc in the film that somebody shared with me that I think is nonsense. Where they said, "Oh, she's a weak, alcoholic woman who, just at the right moment, suddenly she becomes a girl boss." And I'm like, if that is your read of her character arc, that is way off. This is a woman who, like Oppenheimer, is very complex, has damage, has these problems. But the fascinating thing about the marriage that they portray is the fact that she's as complex and flawed as he is. And you can see how a marriage is not story. We are so used to seeing storybook love, whether it's in A Beautiful Mind with the long-suffering wife with the brilliant man, or, good Lord, Meg Ryan playing Pamela Corson in The Doors, where she's this long-suffering woman with this genius man, and it's so... It gets a little tired. Instead, we see a woman. She's been married twice. She had a husband die. She's taken off in the middle of nowhere, but she stays by him. And that's the strength that you see come through. That these people, as difficult as it is for them to interact and relate to each other, because they are so limited as human beings, they still love each other. And at that moment, his wife will not abandon him. She will be there for him because she knows that no one else will be. And it's like that, if anything, is... I'm not endorsing, either of their behavior by any stretch, but you see how love comes in really weird packaging sometimes. Really bizarre. And I can't sit there and say, oh, well, she should have done this or she should have done that. She did what, in terms of this character arc in this film, she did what this character would do. She did what this portrayal of this person would do. Not what I think they should do, not what a therapist would say they should do, but what a person did who was like this. That speaks to the authenticity that all of these performances come to.
No, that's incredibly well said. And I think, like you said, it is the barometer for which all of these performances, I think, are given. that everybody is nuanced. And I think they just do such a great job with that. One of the things, Nolan is not afraid to use his films to say things to which have, resonance with us today. I mean, that's why he makes many of the movies that he does. I think, of course, of his Batman trilogy of talking about different things that were going on in the world at the time. And here, I think he's also doing that when it comes to this idea of free speech and the way in which we're seeing that Oppenheimer, who does develop a conscience about atomic weapons and specifically works towards not wanting to escalate an arms race because he sees what could happen with humanity, being damned in public opinion by people like Strauss, who just want to shut down that speech because it goes against what they want. And, which is, portraying Oppenheimer as being a man who has always been willing to hear all sides of the argument to then come up with what's actually best, as opposed to somebody who's not willing to hear an argument at all and just desiring to, be the one who's at the top, be the one who's in power by whatever means necessary, and shut down any speech that gets in the way of that, was pretty fascinating to watch. And I think he does an absolutely phenomenal job at showing the danger of that type of thing happening.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it shows that political pressure and science don't always get along the way that you think they do. And I think that one of the great moments is when Rami Malek as Dr. Hill comes up and just absolutely blindsides them as far as what his testimony is going to be. And that speaks to, well, you have a scientist who comes along and says, oh, no, hey, Oppenheimer, bad. And we're all pro Strauss, et cetera, et cetera. And then you find out that not all the scientists agree. And it takes somebody coming in and making a surprise attack in the middle of the hearing to suddenly have everything go haywire. And it's fascinating. It's really fascinating. And even having the footnote at the end that it's a junior senator from Massachusetts, John F. Kennedy, that is one of the three that winds up swinging it against Strauss.
Well, and I think what he goes to show here is that just because it's the popular opinion of the time doesn't make it the right opinion, and like you said, with the idea of, saying there's a consensus in science when that might not be the case, because it helps whatever ideology you're trying to push. I think the movie does just a phenomenal job of saying what we should do is follow the truth of the matter, regardless of where the truth leads us.
Let everybody have a seat at the table. It's the old Athenian, a form of ideas. The whole theory is that if everybody gets a chance to speak, the bad ideas get destroyed because they can't hold themselves up in front of the good ideas. And that's the whole idea of they couldn't argue against Oppenheimer for two reasons. One, honestly, he was right about non-proliferation and where it was going to take us. Hey, flash forward several decades, was he right? And then number two, if he was wrong, then, the only way they could stop it was to try to just muzzle him. And it's like the way they muzzle him is by going after him for things that had nothing to do with what he was talking about.
Right.
For that policy.
Yeah.
And it's such an indictment, really, of that whole political game. Of how that works. And that's, again, to get back to just real quick for performances, Alden Ehrenreich, the way he plays that moment when Strauss suddenly realizes that this guy, he was like, oh, I'll tell you how it's done, kid. And then he suddenly realizes the kid flipped the tables on him. in such a way that his fingerprints weren't on it, which was exactly what Strauss was saying. What, like, the look he gave was so masterful of, yeah, you know, just that Cheshire cat look of, I gotcha. And neither one of us is going to say, I just beat you, because you can't admit it and I can't admit it. But you know, I just beat you. Beautiful moment. Beautiful moment. But again, speaks to the dirty side of the political discussion and how it muddies the water of truth.
No, well, I mean, 100%. I mean, that I love you bringing up that moment, because it really does encapsulate kind of so much of, you know, what we've been talking about here. On top of this, you know, obviously this film is dealing with the ideas of the major questions of morality of doing something like this, of what happens when we open Pandora's box, when we rub the genie's lamp. It's like you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. When theory becomes reality, it's the same thing that Jurassic Park asked, right? Which is, you know, you were so worried about whether or not you could, you didn't stop to think of whether or not you should. And those questions are the same type of questions that, you know, we're beginning to experience all over again when it comes to the idea of Pandora's boxes like AI and that kind of stuff, where we're creating this world which we have no idea the repercussions that are going to come, but we can see the possibility of those repercussions being absolutely 100% terrible. And I appreciate that we're making this movie at this time, because humanity needs to constantly be reminded of our own stupidity.
We have a tendency to do things without thinking of the consequences. Yes. I would say that your thesis has a lot of basis in historical fact, for sure. And I think that to speak to those sorts of things, it is timely, because you have to ask, when things like generative AI come up, who was sitting in the room? Was anybody sitting there saying, I don't know, should we do this? Is this really something we need to put out there? Or is this something we should, you know, find a way to, you know, let's sit on this for a hot minute. But then, of course, the counter argument being is Strauss's counter argument. The Soviets are doing it anyway. Why wouldn't we do it? The other guy's going to do it. We should do it first. Well, why should we do it first? Because they can't do it first. Why can't they do it first? Because if they do it first, then we didn't do it first. Yeah, but because somebody's going to do it, but that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do. You know, like, or is it? You know, like, you can talk yourself in circles with all that sort of thing. And then the next thing you know, to your point, think about everybody was freaking out about deepfakes years ago. Mm-hmm. Deepfakes were terrible. Deepfakes were awful. Well, now, so long as we can get Luke Skywalker showing up in season 2 of The Mandalorian, it's not so bad. It's okay. It's okay. Right? Well, or, you know,
I remember, you know, a few years back, you know, Adobe was showing off a new feature that was going to be in Audition, which was going to allow you to, if you had forgotten to say something, it would sample the entire recording and then allow you to type in what you wanted to say, and it would be you.
Mm-hmm.
But you didn't actually say that. And then they didn't use that feature because of how dangerous that is. Because then you could literally make people say whatever it is you wanted them to say, and how would you know it wasn't them? And so, again, you're thinking about these things to which these are reality shaping things, right? And when you can't trust what you can see, hear, taste, and touch, like, you're in a big world of hurt at that point. And these are the type of questions I think that we are being faced with in the world that we live in now, which are the same type of questions that, of course, they were having to wrestle with then about, if we do this, what happens? What have we unleashed upon the world?
The conversation, and I love the fact that they kept coming back to the moment and showed how Strauss completely misinterpreted what it was that was said, or why Einstein was walking past him without saying anything. And I'll butcher the line because I've only seen it once. I'll see it many more times. But when he says, you know how we were wondering whether we would destroy the world. Yes, I think I might have. Like that, and seeing Einstein have that realization of, oh, wow, maybe we did. Because Einstein, again, was the one who wrote the letter. And he himself, if I recall, regretted writing that letter. And it wasn't, the first atom to go off is that letter. And it leads to Oppenheimer leading the project. And it leads to the atom bomb. And it leads to the world changing forever. And, they don't even really go into everything. They don't cover the fact that there were 2 scientists who died of radiation poisoning. Obviously it's 3 hours long. There's only so much you're going to cover, and the focus is on Oppenheimer. You can't go down too many rabbit holes. But even the fact that there's, there's so much radiation and everything, background radiation now with all the atomic testing that we've done, that countries are now trying to salvage old shipwrecks because they have pre-radiation minerals in them, and it's a better type of steel to use for different things. It's like, well, how irradiated is the world right now? Like, hey, what does that have to do with everything or all these different statistics that we see? What's going on, man? So it's like, it's so wild. Maybe we did destroy the world. Like, wow, what a thought to have to live with.
Well, and like so many of the films we've talked about on the 602 Club and so much of history, which really comes down to the ways in which we as humans play God, and the repercussions of usurping our place tend to be catastrophic in ways to which we can't even imagine, unfortunately. And so, again, I think that this is the type of film that is so important for raising those questions, asking those questions, and reminding us that we need to be asking these type of questions. Because when we do things without actually thinking about them and only go off of feeling, we're in a place where we are most likely going to cause a world of hurt that we can't even comprehend until it happens, and then it's too late. And so I had to ask you about this because, a lot has been made about this film not using any CGI. And so how did that work for you? Did you feel the full brunt of the explosions? Did you feel
geez.
I mean,
I'll talk about the Tested Trinity for the rest of the year and many years to come. That was an absolute stunning use of sound and light and editing and everything. In terms of the, quote unquote lack of CG, I didn't miss it. I mean, if it looks good, it looks good. You could have told me that everything was done with CG and I'd be like, wow, it looks good. Look, if you can get the effect and it works, use whatever tech makes sense. And one of the most beautiful, most interesting visual films I've ever seen is The Fountain with Hugh Jackman. And that used some visual effects techniques that were really weird and unexpected. And so, no, I didn't miss CG at all in this. Did I look at it and it was like, oh, wow, I can't believe they didn't use CG. No, I was just like, wow, that's pretty. Wow, that looks great.
Yeah, I think you said it so well. Look, this is all about doing what works for us for the film. And that's all that matters. Does it work for the movie? And you use the techniques that work best to bring the vision to life. And I think that there is such a tactile nature to this film. Even, we talked about the way it's filmed in the first place, the lighting that's used, the cinematography, everything about this movie makes it feel real, but also it has this almost historical documentarian feel to it as well. All of this is intentional, and I think it all works perfectly to make this film come to life which you also mentioned. I think the music by Göransson and the sound design specifically also do that in a way that is a masterclass at making these things fit the film itself.
The one thing I'll say is there are people, I read an interview recently where somebody was very dismissive of auteur theory, but you want a very clear case of modern auteur at work. Christopher Nolan changed his director of photography, and it still looks like a Christopher Nolan movie. If you didn't tell me that Ludwig Göransson did the score for this, I would have thought it was Hans Zimmer, who did all of his other scores before Tenet. That is not to slight Göransson in any sense. I think it's a wonderful score. I think it's a terrifically done score. I love the score. But you have a director who is very clear about what he expects to hear and what he thinks is going to work for his vision. That's why I say, if you had cornered me without looking at the credits and said, who did this score? I'd be like, Hans Zimmer, I guess. It sounds like that. That is all to say that if you have somebody with a very clear vision behind the camera, or rather heading the project, I should say, they will get people, whether it's actors, actresses, people behind the camera, sound designers, composers, to deliver what they want and need for their film. That's why the score is so good, is because he got somebody who understood what he wanted. And it is a terrific score. I will be shocked if this is not up for best score in all of those different awards shows that are going to be coming up.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add anything to that. I think 100% everything about this works. I mean, it's exactly what the film needs, and it fits perfectly. And just having listened to the score specifically, outside the film, it's also enjoyable on that front.
Yes.
So I could not be more happy with just how well Nolan is able to craft a film from every standpoint. You talked about the idea of our auteur theory. I think Christopher Nolan shows that 100% it's still alive and well. And there are very few of them in the world. I was talking to a friend of mine, and I was saying, the only person, and I believe, that is anywhere close to Nolan and filmmaking these days is Denis Villeneuve. His films like Dune, Blade Runner 2049, Arrival are these type of films where we are clearly making movies for adults by adults. But he's the only one who's even close to that, and then after that, it maybe is Zack Snyder, but just, you don't get people like this who are just making these films where literally every single aspect of the film is working together to tell every single part of the story and bring it to life. And that's something that that's why so many films just don't work, because there's something that just doesn't quite work with the rest of the structure.
We are used to seeing, and this is where I always qualify. Quote unquote, golden age of Hollywood was exactly what the modern landscape is. A board of directors / producers, whatever, sitting there, I want this type of movie. The kids want this. We're going to make this type of movie. So we have Marvel films. We have DC trying to imitate Marvel films. We have people trying to establish, connected universes, blah, 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 blah. It's all commodity. And I would say Tarantino is part of this conversation as well. I know it's a Tarantino movie. It doesn't matter anything else. I see Tarantino, I'm like, okay, I know what I'm getting. And if somebody signs up to work on a Tarantino movie, they know what they're going to be expected to do. And, Nolan obviously is the same way. I think that we who, especially Gen X, we're very fortunate to live through an era of auteurs. Is that era fading, or is it going to stay alive thanks to the success of things like Oppenheimer is the question, right? Every time an Oppenheimer is wildly successful, does that buy somebody else time? Does it buy somebody else an opportunity? Or does it simply mean Christopher Nolan's next movie will get greenlit? That's what I always wrestle with. Is it simply a benefit to him and his career, or does it benefit everybody?
Yeah. It's a good question. I mean, you guys are talking on House Lights about, Brad Bird, and obviously you see a director who rose through the ranks and then hit a snag, and never really truly recovers because of it, I think. So, yeah, I mean, it's a really great question. I do want to ask you one more thing before we get to our ratings. And you mentioned early in the film about taking your daughter, and we do have those intimate scenes. This is the first time that Christopher Nolan has had, I would say, very graphic sex scenes in his movie. And I wanted to ask you if you felt as though it was actually necessary for the story and what was going for, or if we could have, trimmed that down a little bit and made it less graphic and still got the point that Nolan was going for.
It's both yes and no. And what I mean by that is, artistically speaking, the only time we see Oppenheimer completely vulnerable, and we associate vulnerability with nudity. That's why horror movies always have people having sex and naked in the shower when the killer shows up, because we know that when we're naked, there's nothing between us and whatever's going on.
I mean, that's why they have that show, Naked and Alone.
There
right?
you go. Or was it? Yeah. I mean, but seriously, the only time we see Oppenheimer, lack of a better phrase, stripped down of all of his defenses are with her, which therefore also speaks to the fact that even though he couldn't be with her, she was the only person he was ever completely vulnerable with. Even his wife he was guarded with. Everybody else around him he was guarded. That's the one person that he was completely, there was nothing between him and her. And I think that, do you need to do that to show it? You could debate. Need? No, I'm sure you could find another way to show it. But it is very common visual language to throw that in your face and be like, this is the most vulnerable you're ever going to see this character, is only with this person. And by inference, he's the only person that she's going to be completely vulnerable with too. So I think artistically it works. But like, do you need it? Like, would the film have fallen apart without it? Probably not. But I'm not going to ding it because I think that it worked for what it was. I actually made the joke going into it because in the marketing run-up when they're doing the interviews, Christopher Nolan said, or somebody said, oh, it's more nudity than he's ever had in his films before. And I laughed and I said, what, like 20 seconds? Because nobody's ever been naked in his movies before, I don't think. And it's like, so, and yeah, I mean, like they made such a big thing of it. I'm like, in a 3-hour movie, it was like, it was a flash. It was, it was like maybe 3 minutes of screen time total. And only only like half of that was in flagrante delicto. So it's like, is it really that big a piece of the film? Not really. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where I did feel as though you could have shot it in a way that gives us the impression or, obscures more and still had the same effect. But I think that obviously what you said and the reason for doing it thematically for the character definitely holds up. So I guess I probably would have appreciated more if it was just more obscured, shot in a way where, maybe that scene upstairs, you're shooting more from the back, and so you're not seeing, everything there of Florence, and then finding a way to, obscure somehow in that scene in the chair. Although I think that scene in the chair, like you mentioned when they're talking, is that way because they're kind of laid bare before one another, and yet the way that he is sitting shows you that he is closing to her. He is not completely open anymore, whereas she is completely open still. And so there's that visual language that happens there in the movie to give you that aspect. So, it's one of those things. Like, again, it's one of those places where I feel like, in a film, you could actually do nudity very well. You obviously, I always think of the ways in which it's used in something like Schindler's List, very specifically and on purpose to drive home very important points in that film. So I think it's legitimate. And I don't think that this is gratuitous on purpose for any reason. So yeah, I can't complain about it too much. And I'm, it's a very small part of the film. So I'm not saying I'm not going to say that. So all in all, John, I think we've had nothing but good things to say about Oppenheimer, and that leads me to the question of what you are going to rate this film.
No, it's 5 stars. I've talked to plenty of people, 2 or 3, where their reaction was, I heard somebody call it mid. And I was like, okay, well, that's fine. It's not for everybody, I guess. But I walked out of this and I said, I just watched art. I just watched art. How did I watch art on a scale like this? I was amazed just on a technical, even if I hated everything else about the film, it would have a 4 because the technical skill of everybody involved in this film, of every performer, of everybody working the sound design, of everybody top to bottom, the technical aspects of this film are breathtaking. And then the rest of it is just cream. So yeah, it's a solid 5. I'm a Nolan fanboy. I get it. I love practically everything he does. But I very much subscribe to the theory that sometimes there are filmmakers that George Lucas is one of them for me. They are just plugged in. I'm in the same wavelength they are. They're speaking the language that my brain understands. Nolan is obviously that guy. Am I blinded by that? Sure. But I mean, that's like sitting down and it's like, my God, this is an incredible omelet. Well, I don't like eggs. Well, I can't help you there. Right. Yeah. But I can tell you this is an incredible omelet. So 5 stars.
I'm right there with you. I mean, this is clearly a 5-star film to me. And I would say that it is maybe the most important film so far of the 21st century when you just think of importance of film.
Yeah.
Because I think that this is a movie that stands the test of time because the questions and the thematic elements that it's raised. So not only, like you said, is this just pure art when it comes to all the technical elements, the way the film is crafted, how everything works together, but this is also a movie that will continue to ask questions that are going to be important for humanity, unfortunately, I think, till the rest of time. And so, therefore, this movie will most likely, of all of Nolan's films, probably be the one that stands the test of time beyond all the other films that he's done in many ways because of that. Mm-hmm. Is it my favorite Nolan film? I think I would probably still put Interstellar as my favorite Nolan film of all time.
Same. Interstellar in the Nolan library of work is sort of like Captain America: The Winter Soldier in MCU.
Yes, that's a good point.
Will anything topple it? I'm laying odds probably that it's going to be real tough for that to happen. Yeah. Real tough.
So, no, but do I love this film and do I think it's astounding in every way possible? 100%. And I could not recommend more that people go see this film and see it on the biggest freaking screen possible. Because you will absolutely not be disappointed.
As a person who prides himself on being a cheapskate and complains every gosh darn time he goes to the movie theaters about
and
the price of tickets
believe me, he does
nowadays.
behind the scenes, folks. I promise you.
Oh, I don't behind the scenes. I complain constantly to everybody about how expensive movies are. It's ridiculous. But this is worth the upcharge. Pay the extra $1 or $2 to go see it in the best presentation possible. You'll thank us. You will absolutely thank us.
Yeah. Nope, couldn't agree with you more. So, John, if people wanted to catch up with you, talk about Oppenheimer, what else is going on, where would they find you?
Gosh, just look for Kessel Junkie out there in the wilds of the internet. And, of course, I have the most fun on Letterboxd, where we can just talk about movies, because movies are awesome. And you can find me over on the Nerd Party Network, co-host on 2 regular shows. One is called House Lights, which, Matt, you mentioned earlier, where we look at the work of directors by different categories. I co-host that with Tristan Riddell and Darren Moser. And, of course, you can find me co-hosting Aggressive Negotiations, a Star Wars podcast with one Mr. Matthew Rushing himself.
Well, I do hope everybody will check that out. You could also find me on Owlpost over there on the Nerd Party Network, talking about Harry Potter. Did that show with Dre Kaufman, and we talked about every single chapter of that series, one chapter at a time. I'm on social media under the name Matt Rushing02, so just search your social media of choice, and you'll probably find me there under that moniker. On the network, when I'm not in the 602 Club, got a lot of other shows. People know, of course, Literary Treks, The Orb, Warp 5, Artificial Tango, as well as Saddle Up. But thank you so much for joining us. And y'all come back now, you hear?